Okay, students, so we're going to go ahead and start our Old Master transcription project. And this is a very valuable lesson. Whether this is your kind of artwork or not, the things that you learned in this can be added to your own artwork and whatever. Basically, essentially what we're doing is we're doing a research project. We're doing like a visual research project, and our eyes are doing the research, and our art is doing the transcribing, trying to understand what these old painters, these master painters did. And what you learn from this is invaluable. For myself, when I was a painting student, I think some of the most useful information that I did learn came from doing this project. So we like to start with Da Vinci, and the reason being is he was the master of not finishing things. He was really good at starting projects but leaving them unfinished. And so we have all these good examples that allow us to see how these painters did their work. Now, I mean, during the time, a lot of these things were very top secret. A lot of the kind of techniques and tricks that these painters were doing, they tried to keep to themselves because their success depended upon it. And we can only guess, honestly, at some of the things that they've done. Of course, there's, very fancy, expensive equipment now that can see through layers of paint with X-ray and whatnot that gives us better clues. And, you're more than welcome to look into that. But for the most part, we can only deduce what's going on by what we see. And so that's why Da Vinci is great. So here's an example of the beginning of a painting. The ground has been painted this sort of light yellow, and that is probably because it's the most luminous color. It sort of represents the light of the sun. And then over the top, we have sort of a grayscale, a black and white, essentially a value painting, underpainting, right? So all the other figures have been molded and sculpted in their lights and darks. Notice how the central figure, I'm assuming this is Mary with Jesus, and these figures in front still have a lot of that luminosity to them. And I think that's because the way that these paintings were painted, they wanted to keep that luminosity, that glow, that sort of like extra brightness show through into the subsequent layers. And so when this painting would be finished, those characters would stand out because of their luminosity and brightness compared to the other figures in the screen. So a little bit of a close-up here. Now, it appears to me, and of course, this is just me guessing, but it looks like the lightest layer was a yellow ochre, spread on incredibly thin. There's little hints of maybe burnt sienna, some of these warm reds. Those are very inexpensive colors for those artists, and so those were probably most likely used. And then sort of a grisaille, and that is a gray, perhaps made out of raw umber. That's my guess for these kind of greenish gray tones that happen in the dark. Here's another piece, and I promise I'm going to try not to turn this into an art history lesson because I know this is really more about us looking into how these painters did the work. But it's going to be impossible for me not to tell you a few little tidbits here and there. This particular painting was one that I got to see personally when I was in the Vatican. And the interesting backstory to this was that this underpainting was probably thrown away. I mean, he didn't complete the work, Da Vinci, and who knows what happened to it. At a garage sale, somebody had bought a dresser, and opening one of the drawers, they found, there was some kind of canvas lining the drawer, and as they unfolded it, it turned out it was half of this painting. And the other half was in the possession of the Vatican, and everybody was thrilled. It's like, oh my gosh. So they put it back together, and now it's back on display. Back then they didn't really care. It was an unfinished painting, but now that, Da Vinci is as famous as he is, it was really important for them to show that. And it's great for us. It's great for us because we get to see his process. Again, you see that light, almost ochre, very luminescent golden hue that's been put down as the ground. You see the reddish browns, sort of denoting the earth, the warmth of those sort of under layers there. There's some scumbling of greens, probably again, like I'm thinking maybe some white with some raw umber in it, and some other color up here. But the very primary colors, ochre and most likely burnt sienna. There could be some other browns added to it. I don't know, like Van Dyke brown or something. But for the most part, you're seeing those first colors laid down. Another one, the color's not as good in this, but again, you can see ochre, sort of a lighter, warm color up here, sort of the reddish browns of the earth. And over the top, a simple grisaille, a black and white value painting that denotes, the volumes of the figures. And this really talks too about, the importance of value or tonal value in painting and how important that is, even more so than color. In fact, it's been noted that a lot of these paint shops during this time period would paint paintings as far as this, and then they would hang them in their shop for sale. A patron would come in, they would see the painting, and they would say, yes, that's the one I like. I like how it's composed. I like the subject matter and the expressions on the faces, etc., etc. It looks good, and I like the values. Go ahead now and paint it. And then they would finish the painting with their more expensive colors, the colors that they wanted to reserve until someone actually paid for the work. And just in the vein of Da Vinci, he was also known for being an inventor and also a very curious fellow and a sort of a scientist. And, like he got into anatomy and exhumed corpses essentially to cut them up and understand the human body. And that's kind of what we're doing here. We're taking these paintings and trying to pick them apart and understand how they work. So back to that word that I pronounced incorrectly before. Let's talk about what these mean, okay? So grisaille, verdaille, or brunaille. And basically these mean the value paintings that are done on top of the ground in either grays, greens, or browns. In most cases, I think in a lot of the examples that we're going to be seeing, the browns were the ones that were used the most. However, sometimes you see examples of the gray, and very rarely the green. So again, let's look at this underpainting. It almost holds its own as a painting by itself, but really it's a very limited palette. There's the sort of warm yellow ochre that you can see glowing through. There's no cool white of the white gesso coming through. There's some tones of yellow. Okay. Burnt sienna, which is a very reddish brown, and it's very luminous. And then darker layers of that same brown layered up to create more value. And then probably some white added to the brown to give the flesh tones. Now, one thing we're going to start talking about too is the difference between translucent paint and opaque paint and how they work differently. But we'll get to that in a minute. Again, another brunaille. This one, a lot of browns just used as the value color, and how much of the painting is actually created in those first layers. And just kind of a step-by-step example of, kind of a corny example, to be honest, of how this works. You start with your warm ground color, you work your value tones on top. In this case, it's again the brown or brunaille, and then the colors are laid over the top. Interestingly, though, if you look over here, you can see little hints of that ground color, the ground that was the canvas was originally stained, peeking through some of these clouds. Oftentimes the layers that are added on top of this painting would be very thin or transparent. If they were opaque paints, they would be scumbled on thin. And if they were transparent paints, they would be glazed on very transparently so that the colors underneath would often come through. It just gave it a depth. This is a Rubens, again, an unfinished piece, so you can get to see, or maybe even just a study, but it's done in that sort of underpainting style. And just a quick formula here for making a simple sort of gray. If your painting calls for a grisaille, it would use something like a raw umber mixed with white, and that'll give you the wide range of sort of grayish green tones that would give you the black and whites that you need. And so here's some that utilize a little bit of, it looks like some burnt sienna, but maybe some other brown, and some grisaille too. So probably raw umber mixed with white in various tones. Another one that's very much a black and white. Little hints of warm colors in there, but for the most part, it's quite the grayscale. And this one on a burnt sienna ground, which is also very common. So not always was yellow ochre laid down as the staining color. Sometimes burnt sienna, that warm, rich red would look really good. And then, the black and white sort of grisaille, the umbers mixed with white, and those value paintings would paint it on top of that. And finally, just an example showing a painting that's probably seen some age, some wear, maybe through cleaning or maybe just through, I don't know, the paint quality flaking off or whatever, for whatever reason. Really gives you an idea of what was happening and how thin those layers were on top. So over here on the left-hand side, you can see a lot of that burnt sienna coming through the sky where the paint is either chipped away or been scrubbed off. Little bits of it are still there, but you still see quite a bit of it underneath. Down here, it's quite obvious. In fact, it's very likely that the painter didn't even have a need to paint any other colors on top because those burnt sienna colors work just fine for the ground down here. And over in the tree, you see a lot of it as well. But again, just using our eyes to sort of deduce and sort of like investigate, dissect, look through the paintings and try to understand what those artists were doing. Now, again, I don't want to make this a art history lesson. However, I want to show you a few of the sort of big shots, the ones that were pretty important and worth mentioning. I mean, there's so many more, and there's all kinds of artists that you can look at. But these are just some that I know about, more so than others. And I did put their dates here. So if you want to know kind of where they were from and when they lived. El Greco, interestingly, was actually Greek and was born in Greece, but he spent his career in Spain. So his painting career was Spain, so he was considered a Spanish painter. Now, the thing about El Greco's work is it's almost impressionistic. It's very, in fact, a lot of modern day scholars, of course, they didn't know what impressionism was back at this time, but have talked about the way that his bodies are very, I don't know, like the leg of this horse is almost elongated. They're sort of stylistic. Sort of the length of the necks. It all feels. It just feels almost like a modern painting in a way. There wasn't this I don't know. He felt a little freer to put this sort of stylistic spin on his work. The other thing worth noting about these works, and I've been able to see them in person. I think they were at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, is that they were shown in a very dark room with light hitting them at a 45-degree angle. And the phenomenon of painting in these layers of glaze, these transparent layers, is that the light would enter the paint pigments. It would bounce off the ground of the painting, and then it would come back out. But as it entered those transparent layers, just like stained glass, it would bounce around and it would glow. And so these things almost they glowed like a TV screen or like your computer screen at night. They really had this luminosity that was just hard to describe. So another by El Greco, again, sort of the elongated, almost alien-esque type proportions of the body, the extra expressively long fingers, and what a great face. And I'd like to look at that more closely, and you can sort of see the sort of colors that were used underneath. In fact, look how little painting is actually done over here. You see the ground color, the reds, and a little paint stroke to denote the side of the neck. So strange. Look at these whites. Well, the flesh tones, but they're quite pale in this one. And how they're scumbled over the top. In some places they're thicker, and so they become more white. And where they're spread out more thinly, like as up here, they become darker because of the tone of the ground coming through. Notice too the violets in the skin and some yellow tones here and there. It's very interesting. Blues and oranges are another really sort of like strong combination that you're seeing in this piece. That is why this project, it's so important that you have good quality photographs and that you can look up close, because it really allows you to sort of deduce and see what these painters were doing. Another El Greco. Again, just kind of a cool subject matter. Of course, a lot of these paintings were religious, understandably. I mean, the people that paid the bills back then were the church, and they were the ones that wanted to have the rock stars in their employment. It makes sense. Here's Leonardo da Vinci. Looking into the background here, do you notice how simple the color schemes are of these rocks? It's almost as if we can already say what they are. There's some yellows poking through, some reds, and then probably some umber scumbled over the top, which makes sort of a complex gray, that greenish gray. And he's able to create all the tonal values of these rocks just using those colors. Down here you have the reds, reddish browns, and then look where he's chosen to use his color. His very expensive, ultramarine blue that was only able to be found in some really remote mines in Afghanistan. Really hard to get your hands on. And so they wouldn't use these colors except for the most important places. Oh, and then this beautiful little far off spot over here. Good. And you can see it up closer. I think this is called, let's see, Lady with Ermine portrait. This is often a favorite one for students to do because it's the subject matter is sort of simple enough that it can be done in the time frame. And it's an interesting piece. I love this hand. And actually, if you some x-rays of this painting have shown that he's changed the position of the hand a couple of times. So maybe the first time wasn't satisfied with how it looked, and so moved it around until he got just the sort of expressiveness that he wanted. Of course, the Mona Lisa. I had an opportunity to see this painting, and I actually skipped it because the crowds were just too insane. I mean, it's kind of funny. I don't know if it's my favorite of the Da Vinci works or not. I don't understand why it's so popular. There's an interesting theory why she doesn't have eyebrows. And this would make sense to you once you start getting into this project. And the thought is that the eyebrows were probably added on as one of the topmost layers of paint. Just sort of a scumbled on dark on one of the most outer layers of paint. And after years of maybe cleaning or for whatever reason, they've just faded off into nothing. Now, I don't know if that's absolutely true, but I mean, I think that's a theory that's worth noting and probably very possible. And getting up close, fortunately, you see all the cracking that's going on. Some of this paint didn't hold up. But there is a good example of what's referred to as sfumato, and that is smoky edges. Edges that don't have incredibly defined, outer edges. And this is kind of an interesting idea because, these paintings were done, much prior to the photographic camera. And so you didn't have that idea of depth of field. The idea that some things were more sharp and more in focus and other things were more out of focus. Because typically your eye, when it moves from one subject to the next, just focuses on whatever it's looking at. But there's something just atmospheric about this, just really trying to capture the depth of space. It's really interesting that these artists were able to come up with this and think about, prior to it being much more obvious in a photograph. Here's one that's a little crisper, not a lot of sfumato here, but I really like this portrait, another Da Vinci. And then just a close-up detail, so you can kind of see sort of the tonal values that they used for the skin tones and the amount of detail that went into this hair. These little fine little highlights in each curl. Quite interesting. And a mythological theme. Every once in a while these artists would do mythological themes for probably private patrons. And this is Leda and the Swan. It's kind of funny to think about because, Zeus apparently came down as a swan and seduced Leda. And in this one, they show them having babies. So these are the children and an egg. So it's kind of comical if you think about it. I also show this piece because during this time, there was a lot of plagiarism, and artists would take another artist's work and basically copy it nearly verbatim. Notice how similar the subject matter and the goose look in these two paintings. This model, this particular artist, I'm not sure who it was, didn't go out and pay for another model. They just copied Da Vinci's work. Now, of course, there's changes. The background's different. In fact, this one's kind of darker and the swan's dark. And this time the babies are, little hatchlings coming out of the eggshell. So, there's some changes, but for the most part, you can tell that the two were the same. Even this wing, hugging the hip. Quite good. Caravaggio. He's got to be my favorite. Probably of all the painters, his work is the most interesting. And in fact, I think there's been some discussions on whether or not he even used underpaintings at all. I mean, you can use an underpainting to make one of his works, but it's been suggested that he is one of the artists that may have used something like a projector to get this sort of level of realism. And there's an interesting phenomenon. If you look at a Caravaggio painting and you zoom in on it like 100 times, it never really breaks up. There's a difference. Like with a Vermeer painting, you zoom in and at a certain level you start to see brush strokes, you start to see where it's a painting. These just retain their sort of level of, mastery under a microscope. It's crazy. And this one I particularly like because it has such a good composition. I mean, your eye is automatically just drawn to this bright light. And so this is where the painting starts. And of course, this hard edge pulls you down into these characters. And the first one you see, this guy here. And then you sort of look over at this guy here. And then his arm sort of helps point you over in this direction. And this guy's looking down. And then finally you see, I believe his name is Saint, oh shoot, I don't have my notes here. Anthony, I think. Saint Anthony, perhaps. But he has his head down. He has his head down and he's, trying to avoid the gaze of, well, you'll see. And he's trying to be incognito. But these characters right here just keep pushing you back, looking at him, sort of in his shame. Then all of a sudden, you can follow the light along this leg. Takes you down here. The light along this leg pulls you back up. The light comes down this way, and even the sword pulls you down here. And then all of a sudden, this bright highlighted leg right here just pops you straight up to bum, 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 Jesus. There he is. And he's calling him out with his hand. And so the painting just starts all over again. His hand brings you back to the faces that go down to him, back up and down. It's just the natural sort of, it's so incredibly like ingenious in the way that this was composed. Another painting by Caravaggio. This is sort of the Roman version of Cupid. Caravaggio was an incredibly interesting character. He, in fact, I don't know, I think was in trouble for murdering several people or getting into duels over, botched over botched tennis games. Yeah, they played tennis and he would get so angry at losing, he would, challenge his opponent to a duel and kill them. And it's funny because the church loved him so much because he was so good that they tried to keep turning a blind eye until eventually they couldn't anymore and he was in trouble and they pretty much, they banished him from Rome. But he also liked young men, which is not necessarily a good thing, but you can kind of see that here as adoration. And he was a bit of a tortured person, talk about the tortured artist. He had a lot of self-loathing. And this is a painting called David and Goliath, or David, let's see, I think David with the head of Goliath. So here he is, triumphant, David coming home, and he's got the giant's head in his hand. And guess what this is? It is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. He put himself in there as the decapitated giant, the bad man. Even in this one. This one, David doesn't look as good. It's not painted as well, but the face is even better. The face of the head of the giant is really well done. And that again is Caravaggio. Gruesome. A lot of these really gruesome. Some of these stories from the Bible, of course, I think it's Saint Isaac or something, or I can't remember. Shoot. Of course, they're in the notes of my PowerPoint, but I can't see them using the screen recorder. So it's very easy for you to look these up, though. Just go into Caravaggio online and the works of, and you can look up at each one of these and get a curiosity of what they are, find out their names. Here he is, he's about to kill his own son right before the angel comes down and tells him he doesn't have to anymore. This one's called the basically Doubting Thomas. This is St. Thomas. Doesn't believe that Jesus was actually stabbed with a spear, and so puts his finger right in the wound. Nasty. Another David and Goliath. And again, a portrait of Caravaggio down here is the killed giant. But just look how luminous these paintings are and how dark the backgrounds are. It's almost overly dramatic. He was considered part of the Baroque period. They were very dark, but also luminous at the same time. The characters really just emerged out of the darkness. And this one's the lute player. I like to show this one for any of my previous drawing students because we've done a project that focuses on this part of the painting. Rembrandt. This guy was all about light and dark. The beauty of this is he was so good with being able to describe light and shadow that his paintings were actually pretty conservative when it came to color. There's a lot of earth tones, and he probably used a lot of his, the cheaper pigments, because why not? And now in this close-up, we can really get a sense of what colors he was painting on top of. You see this burnt sienna. It's a very luminous burnt sienna. Just a thin layer was probably used to stain the canvas. And it's coming through in a lot of parts of this painting, especially over in these areas where the shadows are. It's because probably a lot of these shadows were created mostly with glazing. Over here, you have more of the opaque paints applied much more generously. And look how just bodied and textured it is. In fact, some of the wrinkles in the side of the eye just feel like they're an impasto. The thickness of that paint really captures the light parts of this painting. where the darker parts of the painting sort of fade away in more transparent layers. It gives a sense of atmosphere, the idea that shadow is transparent. And just a close-up of the letter, just to show you what level of detail this person was working. Another early Rembrandt painting. This is a self-portrait, and a lot of the face is in shadow, which I think is kind of interesting. But I show this one mostly to show the hair. And he was using an experimental technique here. So after laying down this sort of, I don't know, bluish color, more of an opaque paint that frames the head, he scraped back through with some kind of tool. See that? It's almost like sgraffito, like just sort of pulling the paint away to get these little fine wisps and curls of hair. Very cool. And it's very luminous too, so you can see sort of the luminous reddish browns here in the dark parts especially. The raising of Lazarus. I don't know, this one's just funny to me, you know. Here, I'm a zombie. Okay, and then this lady, oh my God. And more Rembrandt, another nice one. But not only people, and I do tend to favor paintings of people. I think it's just my own personal, not say bias, but I like figure drawing myself, so I tend to, I don't know, gravitate towards the paintings of people because I want to learn from them. But this project doesn't have to be a painting of a person. Here's a Rembrandt painting of a windmill. Notice how much of this is just those underpainting colors, those reddish browns, and those ochres, probably glazed on top. And sort of the luminosity of either a thin layer of, burnt sienna. And then the actual opaque paints that have been laid down are the sky. It's like negative space, if you guys remember that concept. The sky has been painted negative space, and then this is left in the initial layers. Another Rembrandt, very much in the brown tones. Look how painterly the dress is, or the garment this person is wearing. You can see the brushstrokes almost expressively. And this one, very expressive and kind of gruesome. The anatomy lesson. He was really good with portraits. I feel like you can capture people's faces so well. And this one, which, doesn't look like that much of a painting, but I like it for its sort of comic value. Here you have Jesus. He's come into this inn, and he's sort of leaning back in the chair, just sort of, I don't want to say full of himself, but kind of, he's got this huge glow coming out from behind his head. And here this guy, he's like almost in disbelief. He's like, holy crap, Jesus is here. And his poor wife, she's back in the back ironing or something. She has no idea what's going on. Super funny. This one, the flesh is just so rich. Just look how thick and how much that the layers of paint really describe sort of the texture on that guy's forehead. It's so good. And such dramatic lighting too. It's such a good thing to think about. The lighting, when I talk about lighting in your still lifes, I mean, you start to understand how important it is to the piece because it really describes depth and character and, the drama and everything. Velázquez, this actually was the painting that I did when I did this project. I think I talked about this in another painting as well, or slideshow rather. And this is Apollo at the Forge of Vulcan. This is a mythological theme, so not a Christianity theme. And here we have Apollo coming in to inform Vulcan, the god of the forge, that his wife, Aphrodite, is being unfaithful to him with the god of Mars. And you can just see the sort of indignation on his face. He's just like, he's not happy to hear this news. And here he is with a red hot piece of steel and a hammer in his hand. And then everybody else in the room is kind of like, what the heck? Okay. Now I, of course, didn't want to paint that whole painting. This painting in real life is, I think, 7 feet tall or some ridiculous size. It's quite large. So, I was painting much smaller for my class. I decided to focus on something smaller like this. I felt it still captured sort of the key interaction, the dramatic interaction between Apollo and Vulcan, and it has a nice composition. So, remember that you're not necessarily tasked with painting an entire painting. You can crop it down to something much more manageable in the time that we have. I like how the two hammers sort of make a V. I think that probably talks to the fact that it's Vulcan. A lot of hidden symbolism oftentimes in these paintings. He was also kind of cool because I don't know, he was a court painter. He worked for, the Spanish court, and the Spanish court had a lot of sort of interesting gestures around, like dwarfs and little people, and oftentimes things like card games. He was very interested in sort of these things that weren't as noble necessarily, like these ideas, and so he'd spend time painting them. And probably his masterpiece. This is a giant painting, but there's a lot of things going on here. If you ever take Spanish art history, this is one that you will study a lot of. Here's a self-portrait of the painter. This is the size of the painting that he's working on. This is the painting we're looking at currently. So it's kind of an interesting thing. He's painting it for the king and queen, and there they are reflected in the glass. So it's as if they had just walked in on the room to see. In the background, you have a lot of the paintings in the king and queen's collection, and they're all, I don't know, I think a couple of these might even be, I'm not sure, Rubens or something. I don't know, like an art historian would be able to tell you which paintings these actually were. And here are some of the sort of handmaidens, and then the princesses, and welcoming. And then, of course, this is probably some attendant. He leads you to the back of the painting. Jan van Eyck, he is quite old. Look at his date. He predates Leonardo da Vinci, but he was from a different era, or sorry, a different area. So he was considered part of the Northern Renaissance. And paintings from the Northern Renaissance are quite stunning. The surface detail is incredible. And there's a very good argument saying that they probably use types of projectors or lenses to capture the information that they saw. The one thing I do find, though, they feel like they have a lack of three-dimensional depth. It's almost as if the painting has been sort of like squashed down three-dimensionally, so that the background seems a little bit closer than it actually should, and the floor seems steeper. Just there's something flatter about these paintings. However, the surface detail is incredible. In fact, here's a close-up, and you can see these two, they're holding hands and whatever, but you have this concave mirror, or is it convex? I can't remember. But whatever it is, you see this mirror painted in the background, and in it you see two little characters, one in blue and one in red. Those are the painters. That is the painter Jan van Eyck and his assistant. So they put themselves in the painting. Another Jan van Eyck. Again, just incredible sort of, I don't know, surfaces, the folds on these, they're almost stylistic, but then also the weird flatness of space. It's as if they're like almost sitting in front of a dramatic backdrop. This one, it's hard to put the whole thing on the page because it's so big and so tall. But if you get up closer, you kind of see. And this is, I think, called the Annunciation. This is when the angel is basically telling Mary that she's going to be impregnated by the Lord. And, I think that's what this is. Sort of like the spiritual whatever coming down onto her head. And so, but look at these little like thought bubbles coming out of their mouths. It's pretty funny. So it reads like a book. Anyways, there it is from further away. And then you see up close. And just the amount of detail. I mean, look at this stained glass back here and sort of the swirly sort of, you can tell the glass. Some of these paintings are just insane. This one's a trompe, it's referred to as trompe l'oeil, and that is one of the painting is basically a painting that fools the eye. So the brown frame is real, but these little reliefs in here are actually just painted. They're painted to pretend as if these were sculptural. So these are very flat. These are just flat paintings from brown edge to brown edge, and it's just done in a grisaille. You know, there's no color, and it just gives the indication. And you even see a little reflection of these figures that are supposed to be like sculptures in the black, and that's just painted on. This whole thing is painted. Let me pause. So then we have Vermeer, and he was another northern painter from the Netherlands. This is a little bit later in history. I want you to pay attention to this one in particular because I have a student example where they've done this painting. And the only thing that I'm going to note here is there's a lot of green in this one. And you very rarely see Verdiel, and I'm not 100% positive, but based on this photograph of this painting, I almost suspect that maybe that this was done in green undertones. I'm not positive. Again, you know, sometimes these secrets were kept with the painters and never really released, and we can only sort of like just imagine, use our eyes to figure it out. I'm sure you're familiar with this piece, Girl with the Pearl Earring. This one's kind of hilarious to me. Here we have this, I don't know, slightly derpy looking lady being oh, I don't know, being courted by this kind of goofy looking guy. It looks like he's holding a martini. I'm not really sure what's going on here. And he's being really cheesy and sleazy. And then his friends over here in the corner just totally bored, thinking it's totally dumb. But this Vermeer, I love this one because it's so much different than his other ones. It feels like this was one of his academic paintings early on, and it's mythology. So we have Diana, because you see there's the little crescent moon on top of her head, and these are probably her attendants. So the goddess Diana and her attendants. But just notice the quality difference, sort of this painting as opposed to these. These all seem to happen, well, in a room. You really get a sense of the light coming in through the window and the sort of stage presence of the room, and then the small characters, right? But this one is composed differently. I think this was one of his earlier paintings, but it's quite beautiful. I love it. I love the sort of fabric and how these things were painted. I wish I had a close-up of this one because I'd like to like investigate how these garments were painted a little closer. So, and then we have Raphael. Okay, he was sort of short-lived. He died quite young. He was interesting though because he had some of the most promise, and he worked in the Vatican at the same time that Michelangelo was there and Da Vinci. So you had these three really important Ninja Turtles all in the same Vatican, and you know, Raphael was there, but he died early on. I think of, I hate to say it, but syphilis, I'm pretty sure. But his paintings are very colorful. Notice all the sort of primary and secondary colors. And they were huge. This painting, I think, is like, I don't even know, 18 feet tall or something. It's ginormous. Again, with those really strong, you know, color combinations, red, yellow, and blue. You see a lot of the ochre happening that probably went down in the first layer coming through in the final phases of this painting. Rubens, this guy was known for painting flesh. He was very good at giving sort of this voluptuous sort of like just flesh feeling, just, you know, So you can really just feel how that skin just hangs over the bodies of these characters. This one's good. I love that face. And another one I really enjoy. He just really captured the sort of character of this person. And in the close up, you can see, and this is something that I have to say, it's really important whenever you get the opportunity to look at paintings in real life. Because as much as we can zoom in on on our computer screens, oftentimes it doesn't always do it the justice. Now this one shows pretty nicely, but I was surprised as being an art student, grew up in Humboldt, seeing all these photographs, or I'm sorry, images of these paintings in either slideshows or in history books, and kind of noticing that yes, their flesh looks really good. I just, not really aware until I saw them in person, and then really starting to notice how much green actually is being used, or how much red and green and red and green, or other color combinations. But oftentimes, like, you see these red and greens, and how well it worked, and how it really describes sort of the colors that happen in the flesh. Here's another close up. You notice there's so much happening with the face, but then over here, how very almost expressive, or impressionistic the paint strokes are. A lot less care has been given here, but it gives it a really cool sort of look. And then you have this kind of gray color that was probably made, like I showed you, with the raw umber and white. So let's back up a little bit, see the whole thing in person or together. You see little hints of sort of that reddish brown coming through. So I'm thinking they probably stained this with a reddish brown. Particularly useful here in the hair. And then up closer. And then you can actually see the paint strokes. And Dürer. We'll talk about him briefly. He was also a pretty early on. He was a very early painter. Here's an early self-portrait. And then one of his final self-portraits. It's kind of fun to look at these painters and see them progress. Watch them in their early years as opposed to their later years. He also did a lot of, etchings, so artistic prints, with ink. And this just shows sort of the artist using a mechanism to record and capture perspective, because that's one of those things that always gives people trouble, without a lot of measuring tools and tricks and understanding how to draw perspective. It's not always an easy thing to do. And I mean, even for these, supposedly master painters, they sometimes came up with very elaborate techniques on how to measure perspective. It's a chore. Sometimes painting is a lot of work. In fact, so much so that he painted this he made this print or etching called Melancholia, and it really talks about sort of sometimes the the difficulty of perfectionism. So you have this, I don't know, sort of angelic person, but holding all these instruments of measurement and perfectionism. You have a compass, you have a plane, you have a saw, you have all these geometric shapes, all these things that are sort of symbolic to perfect measurement, even a scale, trying to get everything just right, and how it kind of sometimes can be defeating. But you push on. And finally, these aren't Dürers. I'm sorry, I honestly just threw them in, but just a reminder, you don't have to do people. There's lots of Flemish and Dutch still lifes that are quite good, and they will give you a great challenge. You can see how much of the yellow colors are coming through in the fruit, even in the apple, and then how the reds were scumbled over the top. sort of the depth of space back here. These are sort of like food selfies that people do today. Just a reminder at some points in their lives they had good things to eat. So some student examples. Now, some of these first ones are not as far along, but that's okay. I mean, in a sense, this particular artist, this is actually Jesse Crumb's work, kind of a tragic story there, but he was one of my students once, and he painted this painting. So much work went into the underpainting that it just took almost all the time. And then he started to get into the color here in some of the foreground and the peaches and in the garment and the flesh tones of the face, but didn't really have quite enough time to get all the colors in the background. But still, it holds together quite well, and you can see how this one was built up. Here's a little bit of close-up. Just a reminder too, though, how much of the underpainting does inform the later stages. Okay. Another one in sort of a similar situation. They took on kind of a large canvas and only got about this far, but you can see how much of the underpainting becomes part of the work. And this one a little further along, but still sort of similar. You see the reddish colors coming through, the yellows in the hair, and all of this would be continually to be built up until it reached the level of the work that they were trying to copy, or transcribe, rather. This one's great. This guy, he really nailed it. I feel like this almost looks like an old master painting. In this particular one, he used burnt sienna as the stain to go down. Flesh tones over the top, and then whatever color he mixed to create the sort of blondish hair. And then he used umber a lot as a glazing technique. So using it to glaze into the shadows of the hair and in the background. And there's something very magical about glazing umber over the top of burnt sienna, because one's kind of reddish and the other is sort of greenish. They make sort of complex shadow or darkness. Here's one of a still life. This is a smaller piece, but again, how much of this feels like the underpainting, and then how that just started to develop with these trees in the foreground as they have more color and also more contrast. There's more light and dark. Light and dark here in these trees. So they come forward, and this is more atmospheric, and so it falls back to the background. And I said sometimes people would use dolly, and that's totally okay. I mean, don't everybody rush out and just go do a dolly, though. I don't necessarily think that's the best idea, but sometimes I would allow it. And the reason is because dolly really used the techniques of the old masters, even though subject matter was a little bit more, surrealist, in the way that it came out. You can tell that the painting was done with, a staining of yellow ochre, burnt sienna, all those things, and then the layers of color added on top. This one was done in acrylic, and I think they did a good job capturing the expression of the face, but I just threw this one in because they painted on an old window frame, which I thought was kind of interesting. Acrylic doesn't necessarily stick to glass as well as oil paint does, but, I commend them for their, ingenuity and experimentation. So I like that. Another student example. There's a little bit, I want to say the only thing that I would probably kind of knock them for is some of these lines are a little bit, they just don't, they feel a little bit amateurish in the way that they're kind of chunky. And the only way to get around that is getting something that's called a lineman's brush. And basically that's a brush with really long, it's a detail brush, but it has very long bristles. And that way you can load it up with the ink the paint that you need, and lay it down in one long sweep, because otherwise you have to keep picking up paint and kind of dabbing it on, and then you get this sort of broken line. So to get those lineman lines that you want, those long uninterrupted lines that look more cohesive, you'd use what was referred to as a lineman's brush. Okay, and so then our final student example, just this painting of Apollo. I also think it was done in acrylic. It, remember, acrylic nowadays is just as easily able to do the things that the oil painters can do, because there's so many different um, mediums that you can use, glazing medium and everything that will make this work just as easily for you as it will for the oil painters. I think the only disadvantage is the glazing medium has some white to it, and so it doesn't dry as clear until it's dry. So some of the sort of effects that you're going to get with the glazing won't be as apparent as soon as you put the brush to the page. But again, let's talk about, trying to see how this person set it up. You see so much of the glow on Apollo and the sun behind him as the yellow ochre put on really thinly, so it's very luminous. And then layers have been added on top. You see some burnt sienna in the clouds, and then darker blues around them, sort of in the negative spaces around the clouds. You can see a lot of the burnt sienna down here. But again, a lot of these colors are just mixed with those first layers. And then the cape, of course, that color has been mixed, and the flesh tones as well. Finally, one last little, just as a reminder, I want to kind of show another step-by-step, a more comprehensive one, showing the step-by-step of Brunel, sorry. And so, you start with your painting with the drawing first. This particular person looks like they drew with their paintbrush, though you can use pencil if you wish. And then working up the tonal values in the browns. Okay. Now in this case, they took it a step further. Now I'm not saying and suggesting that this is necessarily what you have to do. In fact, I feel like this might be like an extra step, but then they used white. They used white as a way to denote the lights on top of the brown layers. So it's almost like an extra added layer of thickness to the subject, almost pushing the layers of paint more forward, and therefore the background seems to even fall away even more. So there's almost like a physical presence that the character starts to take because of all these layers of paint. But again, just using white to keep it simple and construct the light and shadow, because we know how important that is to how things work, more so than color. And then again, more sculpting with the white, and then additional layers that start to add color. You got the redness in the cheeks and the blueness in some of the shadows, more of the natural flesh tones, some highlights. Notice even the garment over here is still brown, still in the underpainting stage. I love this scarf right there, it's beautiful. And then in the finer layers, you get more of the opacity of the white laid on top, and more of the reddish and natural flesh tones in the final stage. So just kind of an interesting step-by-step. Again, you don't have to do it exactly like this. In fact, I feel like this might be more steps than you would actually need. But, just take a look at it just as a way to kind of understand how much thought sometimes goes into these paintings, and how there's sort of a plan from the beginning to the end. So I'm going to end on this, and the only thing that I kind of want to just say as a conclusion to this is, first of all, thank you for putting up with such a long slide lecture this time. It is something I'm a bit passionate about, and there's a lot to talk about with the Old Master project. I really recommend watching this movie if you get an opportunity. There's a movie called Tim's Vermeer, and I believe you can get it off of Amazon if you have the Amazon player streaming for something like $3 or $4. It's not that expensive. Of course it's not required, but I feel like I would make all my students that were in the classroom, we would watch it in the classroom. And it's fascinating because when I was in grad school, there was this was a very hot topic, talking about the fact that it was being discovered or suggested. One of the leading people that's written a book on it, David Hockney, was suggesting that a lot of these old master paintings were done with projectors. And I know that some of the students that were you know, in my class hated that. They did not want to believe that at all. But there's such good evidence showing it. And Tim's Vermeer is basically an engineer that takes a Vermeer painting and he tries to reconstruct it. He takes months and months of his life to delve into it, really deconstruct and understand how it was made. And he makes some very interesting discoveries, which, can't be described as fact, but they're very believable. And in fact, he invites David Hockney to come see, and I think they're even kind of blown away, like he's made some discoveries that they didn't even know. I highly recommend it. It's very entertaining. You can watch it with your family or with your friends, but it'll give you a really good idea, or I don't know, comment or camaraderie when thinking about doing this project. Okay, thank you very much, and I have a couple of short demos for you after this, but I'll try to keep them brief. Thank you.